Thank you. First of all, I want to say thanks to Peter for inviting me, and I'm sure also on behalf of Noah and Lisa and myself, thanking you all for staying awake after a long, long day. What I want to talk to about is the interaction of modeling and observations. And I will be honest at the outset that I'm not such a huge fan of giant integrated modeling systems. And I will go through cases where I think models applied intelligently and connected to data actually are very helpful and have resolved important policy questions or can resolve important policy questions and also lead us to figuring out better how a system works so we can improve things even further. And I will say, apropos one of the comments that was made in the last session, I think having grown up here, I would say in the last 40 years we've made a tremendous amount of progress on understanding how things work. We've gotten away from the focus on just entrainment at the pumps. We've actually formulated freshwater flow regulations for the first time in the early 90s. I think we've actually made progress, and I think a lot of that is due to a lot of the diligent efforts of a lot of scientists working, particularly in the agencies, over time. So, since this is a chance to give an overview talk, I'll start it, we'll use the word on in it. I know that's papers in the Proceedings of the Royal Society and things, always like that start. And I want to remind you that what Box, the famous time series modeler, said, that basically all models are wrong, some models are useful. Kenny Rose, in talking about his modeling, often uses this phrase. And remembering that, coming from an engineering background, for us what's important is to think about the practical question of how wrong do they have to be not useful, or turning around, what features might they get right that are useful? So just to remind us, the kind of things that models have been used for in our system have been thinking about the engineering modifications, for example, affecting, proposing, developing, using flow regulations on water supply. These can be quite contentious. They're also used for operating facilities, for example, the Sassoon Marsh Gate. They can also be used to think about project changes. So, for example, the creation of shallow water habitat or, say, the addition of 2 large tunnels. They also are important for understanding how the system works. And one of the ones I'll show you in a second is the role of tidal mixing in the dynamics of the estuarine turbidity maximum, the importance of shoals to phytoplankton blooms. These are both things that directly connect to policy, although they seem on the surface to be very much directly just science. Variability of residence time in flooded islands, some of the work that the USGS people have done. There's a much larger effort, probably, particularly in the coastal oceanography community, thinking about role of transport in recruitment, the habitat of organisms, thinking about things, we do it in estuaries, but it's been used a lot in design of marine reserves, marine protected areas. So the first one I want to show is the model influence on regulation, and the flow regulations based on salinity, and this is the X2 experience from the early 90s. The picture I show you shows some of Jim Claren's wonderful long-term data from the Polaris. This was data pulled out by my student Ivy Wong, showing the salinity, the sediment, and the chlorophyll concentrations. And why this picture is noteworthy is that this is the conceptual model of an estuarine turbidity maximum. This is the one that was used prior to about 1990 to think about how we would design salinity flow regulations. Now, the interesting thing is this is the only one out of 20 years that looks like this. So, models come in and influence policy. Now, this is a very old set of plots. When John Bureau did these plots, our kids were both babies. They're now adults. But it shows what happens to something that might be an estuarine turbidity maximum when it's affected in the presence of the strong shear in Sassoon Bay. What it showed was the turbidity maximum dynamics can't look like the conceptual model, at least how it works in Chesapeake. And as a result, we needed to start over. And once we started over, Alan Jassy in particular worked on thinking about how flow, at least statistically, would be connected to biota, to populations at multiple trophic levels. The model sort of stimulated us to think in a different way, and as a result, there were the X2 regulations that Bruce Herbold put together. So that's an example. A second example, I think, is where models can help with data analysis. And a lot of times with one of the sort of big issues has been thinking about how flow and salinity in terms of X2 are related. There are lots of, it's used to try to make forecasts to connect to operations. And one of the interesting things Mike McWilliams and colleagues did was in trying to model San Francisco Bay, they found that they could use the model to make an inference about how X2 and flow were related. Now, the result they got was different from what we had published in prestigious scientific journal. However, if you go back and look at the data a little more carefully and aggregate it, in this case, instead of aggregating by number of observations, which is a statistically robust approach, you aggregate it by averages, by sort of X2 ranges, meaning we don't see very many very far downstream. You see that the model is actually very good compared to the observations, meaning that the model allowed us to see something we might not have seen if we'd just been looking at the data. The other thing that comes out from this particular issue is thinking about right boundary conditions. This is data we collected in the fall of 2011 showing the X2 variability. So our data is the red one, so the variability through the fall of 2011 when we used to have rain. The two solid line, the solid black line and the dashed line are the predictions of X2 position given two different estimates of the flow. One is the day flow, our standard DWR estimate based on mass balances, and the other is the effectively directly measured flow from the USGS UVMs. The problem is they show very different outcomes. So it's important, if we're going to use models, that we have the right boundary conditions to drive the models. So I think that's a second lesson, that models also help us see, do we have the right data when we compare them to observations. So of course, in the delta, one of the things I strive hard to convince my physical oceanography colleagues is that a lot of people don't really care about 10 centimeter per second currents, the beautiful internal waves. They care about what happens to biota. And this is, I'm not a very sophisticated person, but this is big fish eat little fish, the model, the conceptual model of fish populations, painting by Peter Bruegel. So if we think about this for San Francisco Bay, the Bay Delta, what it comes down to is the thing we can do well now is the thing on the left-hand side, the transport, the physics. We discretize. This is the thing that the weather basically comes from meteorology, from weather prediction. We can do the physical side really well. We can do conservative scalars. If somebody tells us the growth rate, we can do scalars that decay or grow. And in general, there's some kind of law. And this is where it comes in. That's the problem-dependent model. So this is the challenge for us is we can do the left-hand side, but now the integrative challenge is bringing in the right-hand side. What are the appropriate models? And I'll say, and I guess Lisa's not going to talk about this, but something we can do well in terms of that right-hand side, the biology, is phytoplankton. And this is actually a very nice recent paper that Dave Ralston and some other people at WHOI did, looking at predicting harmful algal blooms in a series of small estuary tidal inlets on the East Coast. I think in terms of predicting functions of San Francisco Bay, the Bay Delta, we're probably at the point where we can do this. So an integrative model that can produce phytoplankton and also other phytoplankton, cyanobacteria, different things, I think that's within reach. Now, something that we really want to predict, and there was another comment about we're all agreed on the science. There was a court case only a couple years ago where there were a fairly big dispute about the science involved with biological opinion. One of the things at the center of this was a calculation or a statistical relationship between salvage at the pumps and old and middle river average flow. It's sort of the basically cross-delta flow. And I'll point out something that's challenging here is the least squares fit is that solid line in the middle, and the 95% confidence intervals are the dashed lines. So when we think about trying to make a prediction of what's happening with delta smelt, this is the data we're working with. And when we think about this relationship at the 95% on the high side, pumps are really bad for delta smelt. 95% on the low side, pumps are fine for delta smelt, no problem. And I would make the assertion that the choice between where you are in that thing is a policy decision that shouldn't get punted to the scientist. It's really a choice of decision makers. And no integrated decision system in the world is going to help them, is going to make it any better. Now, it does turn out we have some hope with models, and I just want to show one of my students been playing around with the Department of Water Resources model, the particle tracking model. The blue is observed salvage in the delta. This was in 2000, I think, spring 2000. VAMC did essentially something that Ed Gross had also done with putting particles in the delta that modeled observed townet surveys. The red is what we get with the Java PTM that DWR uses that mixes everything at the junctions. The blue is what VAMSI calculates when the flow through the streamline, through the junctions follows the streamlines. And to me it says when you have something that looks like a better physical model, you may actually do better on predicting biological things of interest. Now, this also allows you to say one of the things that models do is show you things that may be surprising. So the picture on the left shows one of the paths that clusters of particles released in the Sacramento River, apparently appearing to be fish, end up at the pumps. This is the Old and Middle River corridor. People would expect that one to happen. The other thing, though, you see with almost equal probability is a very different path that goes out and comes through the confluence back to the pumps. That's one that opening and closing the delta cross channel wouldn't affect. The result is the model shows us something that's quite important to regulatory behavior, and it's a very simple model, really. This is a model that runs in an hour or less. So I think we can get things out of models that we don't necessarily expect. Now, this is where we sort of break in and say the challenge here, the engineers and physical oceanographers, we love passive particles. One of the really shocking things and challenges for doing any kind of approach of integrated model is the fact that organisms have behavior. And one of the great examples is what's called selective tidal stream transport, the fact that organisms can swim vertically in tides and as a result can change their position. These are calculations a student of mine, Rachel Simons, did for copepods, zooplankton in general, in the St. Lawrence. And depending on the swimming speed, they could either stay in place in the estuarine turbidity maximum of the St. Lawrence, or they could move upstream. Actually, in some cases, they could go visit Montreal. Or if they didn't do it at all, they would go out to sea. So constraining the distribution of organism by virtue of the swimming velocities that are biologically possible is not possible, meaning that we need to know something a lot more about behavior if we're going to say things about how these populations change around in space. Now, another area where I think also models, observations come together is illustrated by the connection of delta smelt and temperature. There's a pretty good understanding that delta smelt don't like very much temperatures over 25. I gather in some things I've seen, it's like don't like means they die. There was some really nice modeling done with climate downscaling, another kind of integrated model as part of the first cascade, Wayne Wagner and other people, showing how as we have global warming, delta will get warmer. And at some point it will become unsuitable for habitat for delta smelt. Well, taking the large network of data that we currently have, a student of mine, Carla Glykoff, plotted up this sort of nice distribution of temperature in the summer showing lots of conditions untoward for delta smelt. She just defended her thesis, and in the course of her thesis, someone asked her, well, is there any stratification? Well, yes. So it's an illustration. There's actually temperature stratification in the San Joaquin, something if we were just using our existing observational network we wouldn't see. But that's enough difference that at daytime, when the surface stratifies and it's getting over 25, bad for delta smelt. If the delta smelt were down at the bottom in 23-degree water, they'd be okay. So a model that would only be predicting that surface temperature would be wrong. And also data that doesn't tell us what's happening over the depth is not so useful. The last thing I wanted to illustrate will lead into really much more sophisticated kind of modeling, but it shows, I think, one of the problems that comes up in physical biological coupling pretty readily, and that is the problem of fronts. And this comes about, and I love showing equations since I teach everything I teach with equations. If we think about normal biological models, they involve predator-prey. The interaction is the concentration of one thing times the concentration of the other. Now, this is something that in engineering we've dealt with for a long time. If you imagine a very small-scale resolved place, you would have an average over your cell in the model domain and a fluctuation, a deviation. If you average that interaction, it's partially the average of the interactions, and it's the correlation of the deviations from the averages also. In a recent PNAS paper, Brock Woodson and Steve Litvin show this. So imagine there's predator and prey in that first panel A. There's a lot less interaction going on than when there is all located in a front, as in panel B. They actually looked at a bunch of different organisms, showing as you go higher and higher trophic levels, that correlation term becomes much, much bigger than the average term, meaning that things that happen at fronts, regions that we might not resolve in ordinary models, may be the most important thing in terms of the interaction. And he did kind of a toy ocean. And in his toy ocean, here's an ocean that doesn't have these fronts. And when it happens, basically it shows you going to a static population of sardines and jellyfish and almost no salmon or rockfish. It's modeled to be a Pacific Coast ecosystem. He puts in fronts, we get oscillations, and most importantly, as Brock showed, with the inclusion of fronts, you have salmon. So the nice thing is this model is a toy. It doesn't explain particularly what's going on exactly, but you can now go back to data. And Brock took satellite imagery, great data, computed a EOF, empirical orthogonal function, of front probability, the likelihood of seeing a front. The amplitude of that EOF is now a predictor variable. Just look at the bottom panel. The red line is his prediction of it's an index of salmon biomass. The red line is the prediction of it. It turns out this front index explains about 50% of the variability in the population. So that the model got us to thinking about something that might be important, going back to the data, see, yeah, it is important. And I think that would be kind of an important result. So to summarize, if I think about, in thinking about this kind of modeling, I'd sort of range of difficulty. I'd go from the easy end of things like tides and salinity. Sediments get a little bit harder. Chlorophyll A, as opposed to actually thinking about species and primary production rates. Contaminants get harder. Geomorphology gets much harder. Behavior of larvae. And finally, ecosystems, going from tidal timescales up to decadal. I think you go from the Bambi problems to the Godzilla problems. So recommendations. So where are we to go forward? I think we should, and I think Cascade is doing this, we should be doing 3D NPZ models. Even if we don't have all of the necessary data, we could couple them to the Watershed models. I wrote IE Cascade Good. I was sort of thinking of Frankenstein, IE Cascade Good. But we should be also thinking about models for not just primary production, but the difference between various kinds of diatoms, dinoflagellates, and cyanobacterias. I think in doing all of this, we should be paying a lot more attention to temperature, and in terms of integrated modeling, that means, like we heard with the talk from the river in Idaho, we need to do some reservoir models as well as these hydrology, hydrodynamic models. I think also that I didn't show it, but I think models like Kenny Rose's Delta Smelt model is really important. The individually based model, and in particular, given the regulatory way that results end up getting used, I think it's very important that multiple models be developed for the same sets of population. Finally, I think also in the modeling sense, we should think about going to things like the ecopath model, like the one that Brock and Steve did for the California current, and at least be willing to try those kind of models and see what we can learn from doing them. Finally, need to keep the balance of observations and modeling. We shouldn't just push forward on the modeling or on the observations, and we should always keep in mind Box's maxim. So if I was going to finish up, I would note that modeling technology, particularly driven by Moore's law, has really advanced. We can do pretty darn good 3D models. We can predict the currents, the salinity. We think we've got conservative scalar transport. And so it pains it to say me, since it's the part I love most. The accuracy of physical models may not be the most important part of getting these models right in terms of practical use. The big thing is that the observational data we have is just critical. We really have to have the right data. And finally, one thing I think that has to come through, and it shows things like the Bureau of Meteorology modeling systems, and I've seen also modeling systems for forecasting temperatures on the Great Barrier Reef. These are things that take a long time to develop. There's very substantial resource investment, and I think it's what it really takes. If we want to do things for the Bay Delta system, we need to have a long-term commitment to support that modeling development in an open way and also in a much longer-term way. So, thank you.